I I had no clue about pictures. So what I would do was half of it is not in the chat. So I have to like skim through the lectures. Forever. And then there were a couple like this last one. I was like, I think that was nice. So I got an 8 out of 10. I didn't do the first one, I don't think. Oh no, I did the first one, but I sent it in like so she didn't zero player. And I was like, okay, whatever.
All right, good morning. It feels like fall today with the wind.
Yes.
I'm like, oh, it's windy and it's hot. It's fall.
I got out of my. It smells like fall today.
It does. It like was cold last night and then hot and windy this morning. It feels very fall-like.
Yes.
I agree. I don't like the heat, but it does feel like fall, I say. So I suppose I'll take it. I wish it would cool down, but I'll take it. I wrote up there, I told you last time, but on Monday we will have a guest speaker if everything goes properly. I'm always afraid they won't show up for some reason. But if they are here, which they should be, we will have a guest speaker on Monday talking about suicide prevention or QPR training. And they'll be covering chapter 7 for us through their speaking, and then we'll come back to chapter 6 when they're done. So look forward to that. I know it's not the easiest of topics. I know a lot of you probably have people in your life that you know who have maybe considered suicide or attempted or even completed suicide, but it is a very helpful training, and you actually do get a certificate for doing it that you could put on a resume or an application. Anything you can do like that always helps you to stand out. So definitely a good idea to be here if you can. And they'll talk about like if it ever becomes too much, you're always welcome to step out for a minute. I will follow you out or somebody will follow you out to check in with you, but you're welcome to do so. So hopefully you can be here for that. And then what we'll do today is we'll talk about mood disorders, right? So that's where we're going to start today, which will set the stage nicely for Monday. Very strong correlation between like depression and suicidality. So definitely kind of setting the stage for that. So what we'll look at are kind of the two extreme ends of mood, depression and mania, and when they occur together, which is called bipolar disorder, and some causes and treatments and all of those things as usual. So mood disorders are incredibly common, right? Anxiety disorders were the number one, right? A lot of people struggle with anxiety. Mood disorders are easily number 2. But I guarantee almost all of you, if not all of you, know somebody who has struggled with depression or maybe bipolar disorder and mania. Depression is a very, very commonly occurring disorder. So let's talk about kind of these two things quickly, and then we'll get into them more when we get to the disorders in a minute. But mood disorders are characterized by extremes, emotional extremes. So you're sadder than like is typical or longer than is typical, or maybe really up and agitated and it's affecting you. When we think about mood, we tend to think about it as two ends of a spectrum or two poles, if you will, which is where the term bipolar comes from. So we have the low end of mood and we have the high end of mood. Right? So the extreme low end of mood we could call depression. And the extreme high end of mood we could call mania. Right? And most of us are in here the vast majority of the time, right? And we can call this like normal or typical mood. Right? When things are going well, maybe you're a little bit higher, right? A little bit better mood, more elevated. When things are hard or you're struggling, maybe you're a little bit lower, but you're still within like the realm of kind of normal and typical. We all go back and forth, usually within kind of a normal, typical range. But sometimes due to chemical imbalances or life events or whatever it might be, we might end up really, really low, or we might end up really, really high. Sometimes people have both. When people have the low and the high occurring together, we call that bipolar disorder. It used to be called manic depression, which makes sense if you look at mania and depression, manic depression. But there's something called hypomania that people can have. It's like mania light, which we'll talk about And so there's actually a couple of different types of bipolar disorder, which is why they changed the name. But bipolar means two poles or two ends, and somebody who's experiencing both ends of the spectrum. So again, with both of these, we're looking at either a really low, sad like state where you're struggling with energy and mood and having a hard time with motivation, maybe self-worth and guilt, or mania where you're really, really up and agitated, frenzied, maybe you're not sleeping, exaggerated sense of like self-worth and what you can do. These are two very opposite ends of the spectrum. So we're going to start with the low end, which I think people are much more familiar with depression than they are with mania. Depression is a relatively common disorder, unfortunately. How many of you know someone who suffers from depression, either now or at some point in your life? Look around, a lot of you, right? Myself included, right? This is something that's very, very common. And so let's talk about some of the like common symptoms with this. Here is this here. We can look at the symptoms that come with depression. Every now and then I feel like I should just keep erasing and see when somebody would say something. Like of all the classes to do it in, it'd be this one, right? Like I just stand here for like 5 minutes erasing the board, like I lost my mind in something right now. I didn't do it, but I don't know why I share those thoughts with you. I should have just kept it to myself. But major depression, all right, major depression or unipolar depression means one side of that mood spectrum, right? So you have depression without any history of mania, right? So just depression, not to say that depression is less, but no mania is present. And in order to be diagnosed with major or unipolar depression, you have to have what's called a major depressive episode. So the way that we decide to categorize these is we have manic episodes and major depressive episodes. And if you have an episode, then that counts toward the disorder, if that makes sense. So that's how we've like kind of broken it up. So with a major depressive episode, if you have one of these, then you qualify for a diagnosis of unipolar or major depression. And in order to have an episode, you have to have 5 or more symptoms, a huge list that lasts at least 2 weeks. Now, for some people, these can last months, right? But it has to be at least 2 weeks in duration, and it has to be more often than not, right? So you might have some moments or parts of days where you feel okay, but more often than not, you're experiencing 5 or more of these symptoms over a course of 2 weeks. So some things you might experience: weight loss or weight gain. Interesting with depression, sometimes people go one way or the other. Sometimes people are so depressed they don't care to eat, and so they end up losing weight. Other times people are so depressed that they eat to fill a hole or to feel better, and they end up gaining weight. So it can actually go either way, weight loss or weight gain. You have a diminished interest in pleasurable activities. You're less interested in things that you tend to enjoy, or you've always loved doing something, you just can't find the energy or motivation to do it. It doesn't bring you the joy and pleasure that it used to. So you find yourself not doing as much. Now that tends to be very common, and it can be part of like a cycle as well. You have either insomnia or hypersomnia. Insomnia is when you have a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep. Hypersomnia, sorry, that's an R. Messing up my R's today, apparently. Hypersomnia is when you sleep all the time. Like you can't get out of bed, you can't stop sleeping, you sleep way too much. So you maybe either have a hard time sleeping or you're sleeping way too much. Can go, again, either way. Some other things, you have fatigue or loss of energy. You're exhausted. You're tired, even though you haven't necessarily done anything. You're just worn out and tired all the time. You don't have a lot of energy, a lot of feelings of like worthlessness or guilt. It also manifests as like very low self-esteem. Like you feel like you're worthless. right? And you don't feel good about yourself in any way. You have a reduced ability to concentrate. It's almost like you're in a fog, right? Like a brain fog. It's hard to focus. It's hard to think straight. It's hard to make decisions. It's hard to think clearly, right? Your mind isn't like functioning, isn't firing on all cylinders. There's a lot of thoughts of death or suicide. That might be something that you consider. Very strong correlations between depression and suicidality. People feel hopeless, like it's never going to get better. And so you might consider something like suicide, right? As a way to escape. One other thing that you can sometimes get, but it's not the most common, it's called psychomotor agitation. This is much more common with mania, but sometimes when people are depressed, they perform like these mindless behaviors in a repetitive fashion. So it might be like putting on a sweater and taking it off, and then putting it on and taking it off. It's almost like mindless. Or like wringing your hands in a way. Traditionally, this is more like tapping. I had a student once who would sit here and he would just click his pen. Much more common with like mania or ADHD. And he didn't even realize he was doing it. He would just be like this and everyone would be like staring. I'm like, stop, really? Just the eyes twitching. But it's really common that when people have mood disorder stuff, they perform some kind of repetitive thing. This tends to be slower in nature. Versus when we get to mania, it could be like tapping or like, something much more like frenzied and up. So people tend to have 5 or more of these for at least 2 weeks, though it can last much longer. And sometimes people socially withdraw as well. They just become very isolated. Again, depression is very, very common. It's different from sadness, right? All of us experience sadness, but depression, I once heard a speaker compare depression. She said it's like the anguish of grief combined with the sluggishness of jet lag. And I thought that was a good description of it, right? It's very difficult to come out of a depressive episode. And oftentimes people require some help, which we'll talk about later. Now, a lot of you said you know someone with depression, or maybe yourself have battled depression. Any like thoughts or comments or stories? There's a lot of symptoms up here, but any thoughts or comments at all from anyone? Thoughts or thoughts? Yeah.
I hate that when you do this. Anything person, I thought it was a Park episode.
Okay.
When the Stan was diagnosed with depression.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only thing that comes to mind. I really hate that. That's the example.
That's what came into your head. South Park, right? But I mean, at least you had an example. You had a point of reference, right? Yeah.
It was like each individual.
Sure. Oh, like a checklist almost. Yeah. The sluggishness of jet lag, right? So the exhaustion and sluggishness of being jet lagged, but combined with the anguish of grief. Yeah.
Can this condition be lifelong?
It could be.
Nature. Oh.
Yeah, it could be something that somebody battles their whole life. So what's interesting about mood disorders, because we talk about episodes that you have to have, people could have a major depressive episode and then be fine for months, and then have another episode and then be fine for months and have another. So it could be something that like you come in and out of throughout your life. It can be something that corrects itself over time, especially if it was an event and you kind of cope with it or deal with it. It could be something you take medication for and then it goes away. Or it could be something that unfortunately you do battle your whole life. It can kind of go in any of those directions. It really depends on the person and the source of the depression, and if you're able to find a good treatment for it as well. Yeah. It can be, right? We'll talk about causes, but there is a strong genetic component. It's like 27% or something like that. So if you have a parent who's biologically connected to you, right, and they have depression, it does make you a little more vulnerable. But it could also be that you learned it, right, from them in a way through modeling. It's a little tricky to tell sometimes. Any other stories or thoughts or questions? Yeah. Right, that's a great question. Ideally, so if you're on an antidepressant and it's not making your depression go away, it's probably not the right antidepressant. And we'll talk about that a bit too. That can be tricky, It takes time. It's frustrating a little bit, but sure. And none of them have worked or, yeah, and so it could be at that point, I mean, unfortunately, some people don't respond to antidepressants, so that could be the case. It could be that you haven't found the right one or the right dosage. A lot of people will try a bunch and then if none of them are working, they kind of just go to like therapy or give up on medication or find other methods. Or it could be just continuing to try different ones. Sadly, it's a lot of trial and error with antidepressants. And you might find the right one and it works and you can go off of it and you're fine. And other people, it can take them some time to really find one that works for them. Yeah.
Really, if you're being prescribed antidepressants, you must be encouraged to go to therapy.
Oftentimes, right? Yeah, so not always. So it could be that somebody goes to their medical doctor, like your family doctor, and says, you know, I'm struggling with depression, and they can prescribe you medication without therapy. They'll probably recommend that you go to therapy. But unfortunately, not everyone has access to therapy. It can be expensive. Insurance doesn't always cover it. So it could be that you are in therapy and on a medication, or it could be one or the other, right? Ideally, you're having support from a therapist as well. It doesn't always happen that way, sadly. Yeah.
Just like a little shout out, the health center does 6 free therapy sessions
Yeah.
a semester, and the health center can prescribe medication like antidepressants and stuff.
Right. Thank you for mentioning that. And they'll mention that when they come on Monday.
It's-
It is, and I can't tell you, like, there's so much stigma around therapy, right? Which we've talked about. I will share with you that I have sent over 100 students in my like 10 years that I've been here to the health center for therapy, for like crisis services. It's so common. And we have this wonderful resource. It's free. It's 100% free for you. And if you need more than that, they'll even often try and accommodate you.
There's a
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Like we're really lucky, and they can also prescribe medication. Like we have some wonderful resources here that you paid for as part of your health fee, that they sneak in there right as part of your health fee. So it's totally free for you. You just have to go out there and they'll help you make an appointment. They're pretty great too. We have a lot of great people out there, which is nice. I have a clip of this. I've been booed for this clip before. But I'm gonna play it anyway, right? My kids are obsessed with this right now, which is just funny to me because it's so like, well, I don't know, 15 years ago or 10 years ago. So probably one of the best examples that I've seen in film of somebody who's depressed. Do you have any ideas who it could be? I'm like, I should make you guess. So Bella.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Depression, right? I mean, I could have stopped it like 30 seconds in and we could have said that, but you see a lot of symptoms in there. What are some of the symptoms that she shows that she's depressed, right? What are some of the signs that we could see in her? Yeah.
Kind of like turning off, being inanimate for a lot of the time.
Okay. All right. She's definitely very withdrawn and like kind of shut down. What else? What else do we see in there from her? Yeah. Yeah. Sleep disturbance, right? Like she's not sleeping well. What else? There's other stuff for sure. What else could we say? Don't make me play it again. I'm just kidding. Right. I'm like waiting for someone to move. Right. What else? What else do you see? Anything? Yeah. Yeah, she's very withdrawn, right? She's not socializing with anyone. She's not eating, right? Which is also again another symptom. Somebody said something interesting once, as like a symptom. They explained to her emails to Alice, like that aren't actually going through as like almost a form of psychomotor agitation. I thought that was creative. I didn't think about it that way, but they're like mindless. She's writing these mindless emails that aren't actually going through. So you see a lot of suicidality in that book, you know, and a lot of like depression that she's struggling with. She's dealing with a lot of this stuff, right? She definitely fits it really well. And so if you have these things for at least 2 weeks and you see her spinning for months, right, then you qualify for a major depressive episode, which then qualifies you for a diagnosis of major or unipolar depression. This one down here, persistent depressive disorder, sometimes called dysthymia. It used to be called dysthymic disorder. Dysthymia is Greek for melancholy. So somebody who's like sad all the time on a low level. Okay, so this is like a lower grade form of depression, but it lasts at least 2 years. Right, so somebody who has this has all of these symptoms on a low level for at least 2 years, right? And it can often be just mistaken for personality because it's so long lasting. But there is like a persistent version of this that lasts on a low grade level for a very long period of time. And we would call that persistent depressive disorder or dysthymic disorder. Other like stories or thoughts, questions, comments? Yeah.
Well, I'm thrilled with the focus on disorders.
Yeah.
20 years ago, my son was in second grade and undiagnosed for high functioning autism. Second grade was about the time where he couldn't keep up socially.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember he came home, we always called it we didn't know it was, I kept saying something's wrong to doctors, teachers. They're like, no, he's just quirky, he's, genius IQ, he's fine. But then he, one day he came home, we always had something called a attitude adjustment map.
Okay.
And it makes sense with autism and water.
Mm-hmm.
But he got in there and he turned on the water and he put his head under the spigot, and I was like, and then my other one, not long after that, he did get diagnosed. But then my other son, he was 13 when his mood came on. It's always been, I thought it was ADHD. I think it was really bipolar.
Sure.
But people aren't looking for it.
Mm-hmm. Especially in children. Yeah.
And now everything I know, everything we've been unpacked. He just had a 7th birthday where he was home and he was without any kind of psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
So the 7-year journey and all that we've learned, I would have done so many things differently.
Sure.
So it's just, and he had pretty much almost all of these.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say all of them. And then later on the hyper, which I'm sure you're gonna cover, tons of that.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a parent, you feel so helpless and you don't know what to do. And the psychiatrist tells you she thinks she knows what's going on. I would have had a better psychiatrist, all of that.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah. Right. For the person struggling with it, for the people in their lives, right? Their parents, their friends, their family. And we don't tend to look for this in children as often. There is definitely like bipolarism and depression that happens in kids, but we tend to excuse it away a lot of the time. And it's interesting, usually when it happens in kids, it's very obvious and clear. But we don't tend to diagnose it in children because by definition, children are learning to regulate their emotions still. And so like, there's a lot of like, oh, that's normal. But until it's not, right? And then it can definitely go over. And you do see a lot of this in the teen years. But before that, we try often to not diagnose and treat it, which sometimes is good that we're not over pathologizing. And sometimes it's a mistake as well.
My first son, and she was like, no, we shouldn't do it now because if he gets diagnosed with autism, he won't get into the military.
Okay.
Like, oh, hell no, he's into the military.
Sure.
I need support.
Yeah. Yeah. And once you do have a diagnosis, you can get support. And without it, oftentimes you can't. It makes it tricky. It's a very fine line at times. Anybody else? Any other like thoughts or comments? Anything else for now at the moment? Yeah. How do you mean?
We got better after.
Interesting. Yeah. It could be, I mean, there's a lot of biological elements to depression. And so it could be something in the like damage that happened to the brain and caused some kind of like change, either chemically or structurally, that could have like alleviated it. I would have thought if anything could go in the other way, but that's, it's amazing that it helped. And sure.
So it's like,
confused. That is confusing. Interesting. I mean, our brains are so intricate and there's so many moving pieces. I would have expected it to get worse, but that's amazing that it went the other way. It's great. Biological explanations. We talked about genetics. Someone asked a little bit ago about genetics. There is a genetic element, but the big one is the second bullet, biochemical factors. There are a lot of neurotransmitters in play when it comes to depression. And the big ones, there's three big ones, two really big ones, and then one third, norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine, right? Those are the three big ones when it comes to depression. Serotonin is like the main culprit. A lot of medications for depression work on serotonin, but there's also elements of dopamine and norepinephrine in play. And so a lot of the treatments that are biological in basis focus on trying to increase the amount of norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. And we'll talk about those shortly. But there's one other really interesting thing that we've learned in the last like 10, 15 years. This is relatively new in terms of our awareness. We've discovered a brain circuit for depression, right? A biological brain circuit to help explain why people might be depressed. And what this means is we have this network of brain structures that work together, kind of triggering each other into a problematic pattern. It's almost like it creates the perfect storm, if you will. And so as part of this brain circuit, we have a couple of different parts of the brain that are involved, right? One of them is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex of the brain plays a big role in our like decision making and judgment and thinking. And so it's thought that there's a like very low blood flow, low activity, and that's why people struggle to think clearly and make decisions clearly and so on. The hippocampus is also a big part of this. The hippocampus plays a role in memory. And so it's thought that the hippocampus is very underactive, and that plays a role in depression. And we also see the amygdala. The amygdala is in charge of emotional responses. So it's very overactive. So people are more emotional than typical. And finally, a very small area of the brain called Brodmann Area 25. This is probably the newest discovery of all of it. It's an area that's extremely rich in serotonin transporters. Now, serotonin is a huge culprit. So with this area being involved, it's thought to play a role in that low level of serotonin. This directly feeds into like brain stimulation methods that we'll talk about a little bit later to try and help people who have depression, right? And so a lot of biological factors. Depression can be purely biological. It can be purely a chemical imbalance or an issue with brain circuits, or it could be due to something that happened. It can go either way or a combination of both, right? And so if we believe it's this, then we have lots of treatments that kind of piggyback off of this idea that we'll talk about next. Okay, so lots of biological elements here. And the biggest one, as I mentioned, are these biochemical factors. Though this is interesting, there's a lot of research now to indicate that maybe this isn't quite what we thought it was. There's a lot of research being done on the role of these neurotransmitters in depression, but they fuel the idea behind antidepressant drugs. Antidepressants are medications that fight depression, hence the name, right? So they're meant to alleviate symptoms of major depression or like dysthymia. And there are an incredible number of these. I have a little video of this that I want to play for you. I'm going to write some stuff up on the board too, but 4 main types, and I have them up here from oldest to newest. And there are a ton of medications in this realm, and some that don't fit neatly into any of these as well, which we can talk about. But let me play this little introduction for you. It's not the most thrilling, but I do think, and I want to play it for you. If you've ever watched a drug commercial on TV, they are required by law to give you the side effects. It's a lot at times. Okay. I don't know if you've ever consciously listened to it. It's actually become a joke in my house. Between my partner and I, we always listen, like whenever a drug commercial comes on, we stop everything and we listen to it. And then we decide if we'd rather take the drug or deal with the side effects. Like we have like a little like debate about it every time. Right? Because some of them are like, may cause instant death. And I'm like, I'll just smoke the rest of my life. Not that I do, but I mean, like, it's that we do that with every drug because it's alarming, right? And they have to give you the most common ones. I just don't know if you've ever consciously listened. So I picked a random one. It's Cymbalta. And they'll list them all for you. So just listen, this is like a typical side effect profile for an antidepressant. Cymbalta is an SNRI. It's a little bit more involved than just an SSRI. So it is a little bit more of like I don't know, a more severe drug, if you want to put it that way. But here is a example of what the side effect profiles might be. Okay. Kind of in the middle. I would say this one's in the middle of what I've seen. And again, this has like become an obsession of mine, oddly. I don't know why. And then names of drugs, like who comes up with these names? Like, I digress. But here, let me play this for you. Very typical commercial. There's always pets in them, right?
With depression, simple pleasures can simply hurt. The sadness, anxiety, the loss of interest, the fatigue and aches and pains. Depression hurts. Cymbalta can help with many symptoms of depression. Tell your doctor right away if your depression worsens, you have unusual changes in behavior, or thoughts of suicide. Antidepressants can increase these in children, teens, and young adults. Cymbalta is not for children under 18. People taking MAOIs, linezolid, or thiamidazine, or with uncontrolled glaucoma should not take Cymbalta. Taking it with NSAID pain relievers, aspirin, or blood thinners may increase bleeding risk. Severe liver problems, some fatal, were reported. Signs include abdominal pain and yellowing skin or eyes. Tell your doctor about all your medicines, including those for migraine. And while on Cymbalta, call right away if you have high fever, confusion, and stiff muscles, or serious allergic skin reactions, like blisters, peeling rash, hives, or mouth sores, to address possible life-threatening conditions. Talk about your alcohol use, liver disease, and before you reduce or stop Cymbalta. Dizziness or fainting may occur upon standing. Simple pleasures shouldn't hurt. Talk to your doctor about Cymbalta.
I don't know who made that commercial.
Cymbalta can help.
But that's like the worst time. They're like, let me list all the ways this can hurt you. And then they're like, simple pleasure shouldn't hurt. I'm like, that is a really bad segue right there. But those are common side effects. Like those aren't uncommon by any means, like agenda, because this is a private company, but they at least give you kind of an overview and show you what it looks like. This is definitely the future.
Major depressive disorder is common, affecting approximately 15 million Americans in a given year. Depression, unlike sadness, is not a benign condition. It affects mood, sleep, appetite, thinking, and the overall ability to function. Of these 15 million living with depression, only half seek treatment, and many do not respond to medication.
Depressive disorders are disorders of the brain. We believe that neurotransmitters, or chemical messengers that brain cells use to communicate with, are out of balance in depression. Also, brain imaging studies like MRIs or PET scans show that brains of people that are depressed look different from those who do not suffer from depression. Depression is treatable, and there are many people who respond to medication. There are 4 million Americans who either do not respond or have side effects that they cannot tolerate with the antidepressants. Some people experience nausea, fatigue, sexual dysfunction, or weight gain. For those people who don't respond to medication, researchers have found a way to treat depression without using drugs.
Dr. Centurion is a board-certified psychologist.
But outside of work, I really started to retreat. I noticed that I couldn't get up in the morning. Even I was working, but I had tremendous anxiety, and I kept trying different medications. And I probably tried 3, 4, 5 different medications, and none of them really worked. When I was having the treatment, I would say I started to see a difference within the first 2 weeks. I could feel myself getting lighter, and then by about 4 weeks was a real difference. And also my family saw a difference before I even did. They would say things like, you're different, you're lighter. It's pretty amazing.
Okay, so obviously they're presenting it very favorably, right? Because it is a private company advertising for it. But I do think that this is something that we're going to see more of in the future, right? It's very successful. It's not invasive, so it's much milder. It's just expensive, right? So as it gains popularity, hopefully it'll pick up more.
They said they do it 5 days a week.
Yeah, for an hour, for about a month, usually 4 weeks, usually. And that costs about $10,000 for that cycle. Yeah, and people sometimes require it again, right? So it's very restrictively expensive, but one day, hopefully it won't be, right? It's definitely got a lot of potential. These two are very, very rarely used. They're incredibly invasive, like surgeries, implanting pacemakers in your brain, in your chest, right, in your neck, right, to create more stimulation of the brain. This one, it didn't really even make it through like a lot of the trials with animals, right? But vagus nerve stimulation is something that is used, but again, transcranial magnetic stimulation is the future. ECT is kind of like the past and the present, right? So these are things that would be used if somebody can't tolerate the medication side effects or it's not helping and it's severe enough that they still need help. Otherwise, we would just keep trying more medications and hope that we find that right one. Anything else? Here, I have one more slide I want to cover, but yeah. You know, some people, so I read a whole like study about it. People said they felt like tingling in their head, but that's like about the extent of it. And then usually within like a couple of weeks, if it's gonna work, you start to feel less depressed. The only physical sensation anyone reported was like almost like a tingling sensation in their head, in the spot where the device was placed. But very different from like an electrical shock, right? Just a little bit of like a tingle. The last thing, I'll stop after this one and we'll talk about bipolar next week. But the other big explanation for depression is the cognitive model. A lot of biological stuff here, right? But then also cognitive pieces. When people are depressed, their thinking is very off, right? People engage in a lot of what's called black or white thinking. Things are one way or the other, and there's no middle ground, there's no gray, right? When our world is really gray for the most part. And there's a very famous like depression cognitive psychologist named Aaron Beck. He actually created something called the Beck Depression Inventory, or the BDI. It's very commonly used in hospitals to evaluate someone's level of depression. It's a scale that you might use. But he talked about something he called the cognitive triad, that when people are depressed, they have this cognitive triad present. And it's very hard to break the cycle of this triad. So triad meaning 3, right? So people who have this have a negative view of themselves, a negative view of the world and their experiences, and a negative view of the future. And having a negative view of all 3 of those things is thought to very much cause negative schemas, which can cause depression. So he talked a lot about these cognitive factors that come up in our automatic thoughts that we have. So let's take, they give an example here. Let's see an example of failing a test in a class, right? Hopefully that never happens to you, but it happens, right? Like maybe you don't do as well as you would have liked on an exam, whether that's a B or a C or an F or whatever it might be, or a 96%, I don't know, whatever it might be. That's mine. If I get like missed 2 on the test, like it drives me nuts, right? But if you don't do well on an exam, like someone who has this negative triad will have like a very global reaction to that. So you fail the exam, and then your next thought is something along the lines of like, see, I knew I was too stupid to take this class. There's no way that I'm going to pass this class. My teacher thinks I'm stupid. My parents think I'm stupid. My classmates think I'm stupid. I'm not worth anything. I'm never going to graduate college. If I never graduate college, I'm never going to get a good job. If I don't have a good job, I'll never have any money. If I don't have any money, no one's going to love me. I'm going to die alone. From a test, right? Wow, right? Yeah. Like, but it skyrockets. It just snowballs. And that's what happens when you have these negative automatic thoughts. Okay, yeah, you might fail the class, okay? Or maybe not get the grade you wanted, but it doesn't mean your whole life is over, right? And so it's trying to rein those automatic thoughts back in and look at, was it your fault that you did poorly, or was it a bad test? What can you do differently? How can we maybe address this? What are some of the steps that we can take to rein that back in? So it's not that your life is over from one little event. But that happens with depression. Everything snowballs like that. And it can be very difficult to rein it back in and get it under control. So a lot of negative thinking, a lot of biological stuff. And those things come into play when we talk about bipolar disorder, because bipolar disorder does include depression, right? And so what we'll do on Monday, we'll have the guest speaker, hopefully, right? That will come talk about suicide prevention and QPR. So that's chapter 7. Those slides are up. Make sure you kind of maybe take a quick look at them, or at least like know that you'll need to look at them later. I'm not going to lecture on chapter 7 since they will be talking about it. And then on Wednesday, we'll pick up and finish the rest of our unit on mood disorders. Okay? So have a wonderful weekend. One last thing really quickly. If you're looking at the syllabus, a week and a half or so from now, the second part of the paper was due. I'll talk about that more next week, but just be thinking about it, or be like starting on it, be looking at it, and we'll talk about that more together next week. Okay. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you all on Monday. Bye. Thank you.